The Sunday feature. Louis Robinson tells the story of the Island of the Living Dead.
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to Buzz Travel Company and to Hydraki Boat. My name is Manolis and I'm yours the captain and also the man to look after you for this lovely afternoon to Spinalonga Island. And I'd like to explain to you a little bit exactly what we're going to do. First, today we're going to pass...
Captain Manolis Koukarakis set sail with his daily boatload of holidaymakers on a blue sea and under an azure sky. Behind them is the harbour of Ias Nikolaos on the eastern coast of the Greek island of Crete. Before them, a leisurely cruise around the Gulf of Mirambello, the promise of a glimpse of the ancient underwater city of Voulous, and then a chance to stroll around the small island of Spinalonga, with its picturesque Venetian fort. Captain Koukarakis gives a cheerful blip on his siren to the other pleasure craft in the convoy, all equally full of tourists. Crete is now one of the most popular holiday destinations in Europe, and the small fishing village of Ias Nikolaos has in a few years become the island's most sophisticated resort, with pavement cafes and bus tours into the mountains and to the ancient Minoan ruins of Knossos and the fabulous treasures in the museum at Heraklion. It's the stuff of the holiday brochure. Captain Koukarakis presses the button on the hi-fi and the hypnotic music of Greece completes the picture. The visitors peer into the water at the remains of the sunken city of Voulous, trying to spot blocks of masonry or a flight of stone steps. Then it's on up the coast, past Bird Island and the sea cave reputed to have been the haunt of the pirate Barbarossa. From his trawler off the island of Rhodes, 75 miles away, Captain Koukarakis' brother calls him up to discuss the day's catch. Behind the carefree atmosphere of Ias Nikolaos in high summer, the life of the fishing community that it still is goes on. For the moment, Koukarakis' haul is his cargo of tourists. The island of Spinalonga has appeared ahead.
I hope you heard about Spinalonga. It's a little tiny island on the northwest side of this Mirabello Gulf, with the Venetian fort all around to the island and the Leper colony inside. Today, because the weather is very, very calm, we're going around to the island to see Spinalonga from the boat before we landing on the island.
The visitor's cocoon of well-being might evaporate slightly as the small island draws closer. Even for Captain Koukarakis, who delivers the same speech over his boat's loudspeaker every day during the long summer months, this island will always have its darker side. Spinalonga is a granite rock, prized for centuries for its strategic position. Low fortifications built into the rock face run along almost its entire circumference of about 2 miles. There's a turret, a tower, and a fort built like a blind bay window facing the sea. From this impregnable position, the Venetians controlled all the shipping throughout the Gulf of Mirambello. Captain Koukarakis points out the lettering carved 2 meters high into the walls.
Now we see now the letters very, very clear, and it says, Lucas Michael Provision Generali Crete 1579, the year Spinalonga had been built. We're going to see in a few seconds the main gate of Spinalonga Fort.
Into view now a small jetty sandwiched between the rocks. Beyond it, an old stone gate into the fort, again bearing carved lettering and a sculptured white lion, a symbol of Venetian power and might. The boat rounds the headland and approaches another jetty below the fort. Apart from the old gate, there is only one other entrance into the inner part of the island.
In a few more minutes now, we land into the small quay of Spinalonga Island. Please, we move now down below to the center of the boat. Thank you.
Each tourist discovers what it must have been like to be incarcerated on Spinalonga. They pass into the cool dampness of a tunnel more than 60 feet long, guarded by a strong wooden door. They walk in the sunshine, somewhat at risk from decaying drunken balconies above, along the old paths, where the walls of the houses are crumbling into rubble, and flowers, grasses and trees grow rampant through sagging doorways. Today, perhaps for the first time in its recorded history, Spinalonga is deserted, given over to the honeybees and birds. For more than 50 years, before the last residents of these houses left the island in 1957, Spinalonga was a place of pain, hardship and suffering. The Cretan people of the villages around the bay, Ilunda and Plaka and Ias Nikolaias, sometimes still call it the Island of the Living Dead. Spinalonga was the last leper colony in Europe. But healthy people had visited and worked on the island amongst the lepers. As a boy, Captain Manolis Koukarakis went there in his boat to scramble about the rocks, and with his father, who was a carpenter. Captain Koukarakis lost his fear of the lepers and had great affection for them in their suffering. Over many years, they had built a community for themselves in the old Turkish houses, which he remembers.
This is the greengrocer shop with the 2 doors. And here is used to sell material, clothes and different things. And the shop further down on the left-hand side used to be the fishmonger shop. You see the table inside in bits and pieces. And some fish boxes, I remember, outside here. And the beautiful lobsters jumping up and down, octopus. And on the top there, you see the box on the top corner, used to keep cheese, if you believe it or not.
The single path round the island effectively marked the limit of the lepers' existence. And if the buildings could speak, they would reveal something of the pain and primitive surgery endured by those who had suffered and mostly died there. But the sun and the scent of flowers dispel any disturbing thoughts that might intrude into what is today, for thousands of tourists, just another excursion.
This is the Venetian palace, built by Venetians. You see the height. How high is inside, the roof, you recognize the building, and the perfect condition 400 years here.
And so back to the jetty and the clean white boat, the Hydraki. The bar is opened, the afternoon sun gets hotter, and the memory of the island soon fades. But it didn't for Beryl Darby. Beryl Darby, a school secretary from Brighton, had always liked Crete. She and her husband had taken family holidays there. She'd read something about Spinalonga in England and began to wonder what the human story was behind the fleeting impression which is all the tourist can hope to gain from a visit to Spinalonga. Mrs. Darby decided to see the island for herself.
I can't say that it surprised me when I saw it. It was somehow very much as I imagined it would be. It didn't worry me, the fact that there had been lepers there. I felt that people should know about it, and they should know the truth about it, that the fact it had been used virtually as a penal colony for lepers.
Now, 1 or 2 books had been written about Spinalonga, which included some first-hand accounts. Captain Koukarakis offers his own book to his daily boatload of tourists. It's based on his own knowledge, and papers left to him by the former governor of the island, Dr. Grammatikakis, who was a family friend for many years. But then Beryl Darby decided that she'd like to write her own book about Spinalonga, to try to get at the story which she felt must lie behind the sunshine, the flowers, and those deserted houses. But to do that was going to need hard work.
I couldn't get any satisfactory answers to my questions by asking around in Crete. Everyone seemed very vague about what had happened, as though it had happened 200 or 300 years ago, and not just a matter of 30 years.
The island had closed only in 1957, the last residents taken away to hospital in Athens after a long campaign to close it once an effective drug to control leprosy was discovered. So much Beryl Darby had been able to glean. But what had happened to the many victims of the disease in the 50 years or more that Spinalonga was a leper colony? Captain Koukarakis' book contained an important piece of information. The name of the sanatorium in Athens where the remaining lepers had been taken. And Beryl Darby had a very useful person to help her, her stepdaughter Anita, who lives and works in the city. Beryl Darby went home to Brighton and wrote to Anita. Perhaps some of the last 30 inhabitants of Spinalonga could be traced. Anita began the search and discovered one man who had been a leper on Spinalonga, working now as an orderly at the hospital. Like many people, Anita confessed to being nervous and apprehensive about meeting a sufferer face to face, so for a long time she only spoke to him on the phone. Only months later, after Beryl Darby's guidebook was published, did Anita decide to go to the State Hospital for Contagious Diseases near Athens to meet the man whose broken voice she'd got to know so well. It was still with some trepidation that she entered the hospital grounds. There, waiting for her, was a small man in his 70s, whose voice and face bore the disfiguring signs of a victim of leprosy.
I just said to him that I was very pleased to meet him after all this time and phone calls and not seeing him from close up.
He asks us only to call him George. George leads us up to a first-floor balcony. All round the hospital sprawls a city suburb. The lepers are no longer isolated from society. George invites us to sit on a bench near him. Another man joins us, who we shall call Spiros, slightly younger than George. Leprosy has disfigured them both, faces flat, skin scarred from ulceration before the disease could be controlled, noses almost gone, no eyebrows, and both men with mostly only stumps of fingers and thumbs. They sit and look at Beryl Darby's book. The pictures are of Spinalonga today, but they see it as it was. Spiros points to a page and explains, "The prisons, those are the prisons." "I was there for 8 days, mutters George. Whenever we protested about the system, we were sent to prison. This is the recreation building, and this is Limodakis land, and there's the lion, and this is the sign of St. Mark, here, near the fort." And without prompting, memories pour from the two men sitting on the sunlit balcony. From George.
I have lived through circumstances that go beyond the human mind. I have seen a patient having his arm cut off with a saw and getting well. One could say that you could see God clearly being present and assisting. I saw it. I was holding the sick person's hand. The patient was sitting in a chair through all this. They gave him morphia locally. And with iodine, I don't know what else he used, the bleeding stopped and the wound closed.
The lepers of Spinalonga lived from day to day, disfigured, disheartened, and in tremendous pain. With no proper hospital, infrequent contact with their families, the stigma of their disease, and their isolation, theirs was the lot of the leper down the ages. Spiros was 18 when the dreaded disease showed itself in him. He was banished to the island in 1941.
Listen, when I contracted the illness, I went to Spinalonga. I lost everything. There wasn't anything left for me. Oh, it was a life of isolation.
Well, the mutual support kept us going.
Just the mutual support of the sick.
In 1903, Spinalonga was occupied by a colony of Turks. The government of the new Greek Republic couldn't shift them because the island was impregnable. In 1903, the Greeks simply declared the island a leper colony. So the Turks left. But the island, which for so long had kept people out, could just as effectively keep people in. This meant that the last painful episode in the island's history was about to begin. When George went to Spinalonga in 1929, there was only a small staff of 5 on the island. It didn't include a doctor. He had to come from Ias Nikolaias, if the sea wasn't too rough.
There in Spinalonga, one doctor would come, if the weather allowed. He had to face gynecological problems, surgery, ocular problems, and all kinds of other diseases. Of course, I can't say he was a specialist for all of them.
George and Spiros have lepromatous leprosy. It's the worst of the two kinds. The other, tuberculous leprosy, runs a relatively benign course, and it's often self-healing. The progressive form leads to the destruction of the nerves, the absorption of bone, and a rotting of the body's extremities. It was that form of a disease which George and Spiros contracted.
Look, the disease comes in different forms. There are cases where nothing more than a little finger or an eyebrow are affected, all the other parts of the body being healthy. But then there are cases when the disease produced horrible deformities, especially before the drug came. You see before you 2 such people.
Don't look at us. We are the old victims. They can't do anything for us now. They cannot put our hands right or anything.
There's still no complete cure for leprosy. But in 1941, the outlook was entirely changed by the discovery of a drug which could arrest its progress. The drug came too late for George and Spiros. It didn't save them from their terrible disfigurement. But it probably saved them from death. It also transformed the lives of all leprosy victims by making them completely non-infectious to other people. There was to be another bitter irony for George and Spiros before their eventual freedom and their hope of a better life, as we'll hear later. First, though, we must go back to find George as a young teenager in a village in Crete, the most intelligent child in his family, hoping to become a scientist, but whose future was cruelly snatched away.
I had an aunt and 1 uncle. I didn't know they were ill. When I was at high school in the town, my aunt took me to her house and I would eat there and everything. She was ill at the time. I say she was ill. She had it in her finger and used to tell me that she burnt it. But it was the disease. I caught it from her. When I saw signs of the disease, I said that I would leave during the night. I had my brother here in Athens, and I pretended I was to continue my studies here. There wasn't much fuss about it. When, of course, I came here to Athens, I fell into the hands of doctors who I thought could cure me. But the disease was not curable. There wasn't any medicine.
George was sent to hospital in Athens. Today, the only reminder of that place is its heavy gate and pointed iron railings. The hospital has been rebuilt in the grounds of the old one. The conditions weren't ideal to start with, but when it was decided that all the lepers in Greece should be contained in the same place for fear of contamination, it became unbearable. Once they'd all been moved there, each small ward held 64 patients. There wasn't enough water from normal supplies, so it was brought from other parts of the city in filthy barrels. Sometimes it didn't arrive at all.
We weren't allowed to ask for anything. We were afraid. All around was a high wall and guards. In those years, we were not allowed out. We would sneak out. Once a patient sneaked out to buy a pair of shoes, and they shot him. We were worse than the lepers in Africa.
The sick were put out of reach because they were thought of as something dangerous, something frightening. Leprosy. Stay away.
Yes, the general hospitalization here was very bad. Weeks would pass before we would see a doctor, and if our backs ached, they would say, "Take a piece of cardboard and fan yourselves."
George decided that life in the prison-like regime of the hospital was intolerable. Together with some young men and women, he went on hunger strike and refused to comply with regulations. The protest turned into violent revolt. He and others were forced into straitjackets.
I will tell you an incident. They brought us the food from downstairs. There wasn't any salt or oil. Now, if you threw this rice on the ground and watered it, it would sprout. So I took hold of the pot, threw it across the floor, saying only pigs would eat it. The manager came upstairs and told me off and said I was causing an uprising. I said I wasn't. I was acting on their behalf. So this was the reason I was sent to Spinalonga.
But before this, George had managed to get out to see his mother, who was now in Athens with his 5 brothers, for the last time.
My mother was crying, didn't know why I was going. I said, "Mother, don't cry. I'm going to Egypt, to Alexandria, for a better life." She was a plain village woman. I don't know whether she believed me or not, but she fainted. I couldn't control myself, so I bent and kissed her. Then I went and boarded a ship. I asked myself 10 times, why, why? The voice inside of me said, "Don't ask why. You have a lot of work to do." So finally I reached Spinalonga.
The story that Anita sent back to Beryl Darby in Brighton was harrowing. The pain of leaving loved ones and the fear of what awaited them must have been overwhelming to all who were sent to Spinalonga.
That must have been a shattering experience, to actually come to terms with the disease. Probably, in the first instance, believe that you haven't got very long to live, that you can never get married, that you can never follow the career that you wanted to follow, even if it was only being a farmer like your father. To have had to come to terms with all those things in one go, it's not surprising that I have heard that some of them did commit suicide.
In the seafront cafes of Aias Nikolaios, the men break into dancing at the slightest promise of a glass of ouzo and share communal plates of red mullet, artichokes and potatoes. Captain Koukarakis took us to meet Manolis Haniotis. He's now in his 60s. He was a boatman who often took provisions over to the island and also ferried sad human cargoes, which arrived at Aias Nikolaios from all over Greece. It's a bleak picture the boatman paints. A young man or woman sitting in his boat, looking back at the mainland and then forward to the Venetian fortress where they'd spend the rest of their days.
I went to Spinalonga to die. That was the destiny of every sick person who was sent to Spinalonga. We all knew there was no hope of leaving there.
George was only 15 when he found himself sailing towards that small landing place on Spinalonga.
When we were near from Aias Nikolaos to the pier, the sick from the castle came to the Venetian door. There were about 15 to 20 of them to see what the Caicque wanted. They saw a young man come off. I didn't have any signs yet for the disease. So some would say, "Don't be afraid." Others would say, "You'll get well here. Where are you from?" "I'm from Hanya." They tried to give us courage. No one would say, "Well, you're going to leave your bones here." They were full of humanity.
When something like that happens to you, you are in a daze, unaware of what is going on around you. The resident said, "Here comes a fellow sufferer." But what can you feel when you have lost everything? There is nothing left for you but to gradually die. But you didn't know under what conditions you would die. You didn't know what else the leprosy would bring. Xeris Yorko, my opinion is we face the situation strongly because we either had to fight or fall in the sea. Siphonis Yorko, do you agree, John?
Yes, yes. Well, we survived because we had strong willpower. We hadn't forgotten what we left behind. Our books, our music were inside us, stored away. Now, if we didn't have the strength or the willpower, we would have jumped in the sea like one girl did. You remember?
Yeah.
She was in love with someone but had to separate, and love then wasn't as it is today. She was very ill after the separation, had to be locked up, and that's when she drowned in the sea. They threw you away like a dog, gave you 750 drachmas, sent a doctor out who cut off arms with a saw, as we said before. No medicine. Very rightly, some call Spinalonga hell.
I can tell you something, though. We saw examples of self-sacrifice I don't think any other class of people would live through. We saw a woman whose husband had leprosy gather her things up and follow him to the island and die there with him.
Yes, I remember.
But as George said earlier, he felt that some other reason had sent him to Spinalonga, not only the authorities. The conditions he found were unspeakable. Remember, educated middle-class Greeks were now beginning to be sent to join the original settlers, the poor lepers of Crete. They'd had to make the best of what they'd found on Spinalonga.
It was so primitive. They had to make do or improvise. I mean, even the building, to make themselves a weatherproof home, they had to rob the buildings which had been built originally either by the Venetians or the Turks. Particularly the original lepers who were there, who were the ones who came from the caves on Crete. They'd just been rounded up and sent out there. And I think for them, life was far, far harder, and they literally lived a day-by-day existence, just sheltering whatever ruins would give them any shelter.
In 1924, there'd been a staff of just 5. A secretary, a watchman, a priest, a boatman, and a foreman. No doctor. Dr. Grammatikakis' papers give a glimpse of what the reality of life was like on the leper colony. Document from the National University of Physicians, 1927. Mr. Citimarkis, 20 years old, born Lamia, confirm he has contracted leprosy. Letter to the Greek government in Athens. Please help us. There is a group of lepers who are threatening the governor of Spinalonga. There were squabbles about the amount of government subsidy paid. Letter from the governor of Crete to the governor of Spinalonga. New lepers must not be allowed the same payment as existing lepers. And a receipt for a payment of 30 drachmas a month to a leper, each payment witnessed twice. Although Spinalonga was their prison, it also offered the lepers a kind of freedom.
When you'd come from a very overcrowded hospital ward or a cave, it must have seemed like freedom to suddenly be able to walk round a 2-mile island and do as you pleased each day and go out in the sunshine if you wanted to or stay indoors. After the conditions you had lived in, it must have been absolute freedom and a great joy to them to be able to mix freely with the other people on the island and not have to announce themselves, "Don't come near, I'm a leper."
While others at that time were begging for a piece of bread, and sick people were thrown in huts and mistreated, Spinalonga was something good for that time, in my opinion. The sick leper had his pension, his room, his clothes. He had his doctor, his medicine. He had his money and could buy what he wanted and eat what he wanted. He lived in a village.
Contact with the mainland began. Captain Koukorakis remembers the rules stated that every visitor, before he left, had to be disinfected in the small building between the gate and the sea.
And this is the main gate. You see all these cabinets there. You also have things on the top. Steam boiler come from the bottom there, like you see the black thing over there. And in this corner here, the table, I remember very well. I never forget in my life. Here, he used to basin for the people to wash with methylated spirit. The healthy people. You have to chew one by one from this side. And here, you used to have the small sink. And the healthy people just put their hands and wash their face. Not the eyes, of course, because that is very strong. And afterwards, the boatman, he waits them on the front the key, and they take the people opposite Spinalonga to the Plaka fishing village. Because I explained to you before, nobody allowed the healthy to stay overnight in this leper island, except something very important or something an emergency.
Today the wind whips across the Bay of Mirambello from the mainland of Crete. In the days of the colony, the lepers had to rely totally on the villages of the Plaka, Ilunda, and Ias Nikolaos to ferry the food across the water to them, food which they bought with their small government allowance.
Meat, eggs, vegetables would come from outside. You could buy what you wanted. It was good. It was all fresh. We had fresh fish. We fished ourselves. We had nets sometimes. We even used dynamite, and during the occupation, the Italians would fire at us.
Sometimes a boat would come in the afternoon with a post, or with a visitor for us. The contact was almost daily, as long as the sea was calm. We weren't buttoned up. It was as though we were in our own village.
Yes, as a matter of fact, there was a large staff of women. Healthy women, of course, from the mainland. How many were there? About 25?
About 25. And these people didn't take any kind of precautions. They would touch the sick people, talk with them, just as we are talking now, without any kind of reservations. This meant a great deal to us, you see. But we used to say to each other, don't they know what they are doing?
Of course, but don't you remember? These women used to have sexual relations with us lepers, but not one of them ever caught the disease. It was impossible to believe that a man full of sores and pyorrhea could go with a young, healthy woman have children, and yet neither she nor the child would contract leprosy. Now, I'm saying this not to preach to you. The religious feeling we had rose a little higher than the earthly. Our faith was very strong.
When someone is a leper, he is looking for help. And we said that maybe that help will come from God. He is searching to be saved by someone, something unknown.
A service is held once a year in the island church of St. Panteleimon. Weddings are celebrated between lepers. They married for mutual support as much as for love, though they knew that one or other partner could soon be alone again.
The weddings were in accordance with the church, with the marriage license, the wreaths, and a party with the wedding dress. I can even say they were more fanciful than outside. The priest would go through the whole ceremony. Here he doesn't. We would stay up very late at the feast.
Till morning sometimes.
I was married, of course. I married again later.
I will tell you my own story. I married a woman who worked on Spinalonga in 1944, and we have been together ever since, and she is completely healthy. We are in the same house, same bed.
My wife called me and said, I want to tell you something. Tomorrow, 5 to 12, I'm going to die. Sure enough, 5 to 12, she died. Now tell me now, how could that be? Even now I feel shaken as I tell you all this.
If such a marriage produced offspring, then the government would take a hand with the future of the child.
We didn't mention the fruit of these relationships. Several children were born. They would take care of the baby until it was about a year old. Then the ministry ruled that the child had to be taken away and put in an orphanage in Athens. Of course, the parents felt like any other parents who were separated from their loved ones.
But on the other hand, they didn't want the child to become a leper. It was better to let them go. There were children born whose parents were both lepers, and even these children were healthy and live in society today.
There were child lepers who were sent to Spinalonga. George remembers 2 children of 12 or 13 being ferried to the gate in the Caike. Spiros knew a little girl called Anna, who was only 5 years old.
When someone was really bad, you yourself would go and stay up all night by his side. That is what gave us some kind of meaning in our lives.
Oh, yes. Our pain made us love each other and be united. We treated each other as a close relative. It didn't make any difference where he was from or what his name was.
That's why I said I'm not trying to act the good Christian or preach to you, but we would say for us not to catch any infection or anything else, God must really exist. I can't remember one single case where a person died from blood poisoning. Some would have gangrene, but that was due to the disease. But from something else, I can't remember that happening. I can't even remember if we ever had any pure spirit. We might have.
We had cotton wool. We would wash our clothes in water which was not even sterile.
But we had one advantage. Our rooms were spotless. Maybe this neutralized the germs. If you went inside those houses, they were clean, whitewashed, and homely.
Death came often. The Venetians used to consign their dead to the deep. They built a chute into one of the stone walls and slid the coffins into the sea below. The lepers laid out their own graveyard on a small promontory. The wood for the coffins came over from the mainland, and the disease sometimes governed their shape.
Now this used to be the coffin workshop. We used to have a leper craftsman, and used to bring some soft timber from Major Nicholas, always by boat, of course, and they make the coffins or make the small square boxes for the people who got their arms or legs. And also the same craftsman he make the wood crosses from the graves.
The Greek Orthodox Church forbids cremation, so the need to bury the victims of leprosy created severe problems on a tiny island. Near the coffin maker's hut are 44 concrete-lined graves, each with a lid with an iron ring set in it. They're in 4 rows. The bodies of most of the lepers, who couldn't afford a better burial, were simply placed in these concrete holes and left to decompose with the action of the air. Today, most of the lids are off, which makes a grim sight.
Now this is the graves. You see, the people used to save a little bit money. That is the top one for the graves. And as you see, almost these graves is we left it open, like this one here, for the fresh air to circulation all the time. Because if you seal these graves, you see these rings here, just make it easy to lift up the tops. And as you see the skeleton inside, some bones, the skull.
As the years went on, the ever-mounting deaths among this pitiful community called for even more drastic action. Captain Koukarakis led the way to a low tower with a roof and an open doorway, which looks down into a deep pit.
And this is the hole to throw away about 400 lists inside here. Look on the bottom, the bones, the skulls, and you see the wood boxes for the people who got the arms and legs. Make the special wood box and check inside. You see, one leper skeleton on the top, another. And I suggest I see more than 400 lepers inside. And this room is called Kimiterion on the Greek Orthodox Church. It's place for the human to rest forever.
George's leprosy, he says, hit him like a thunderbolt. But he came to terms with it by believing that he'd been sent there for a purpose. He became a member of the nucleus of people determined to change the conditions on the island. Beryl Darby's book shows how the new spirit was gradually built up.
They were quite capable of nursing their own people, of growing food, of improvisation. I mean, the water tanks, which they built by taking over the Venetian idea of the watersheds and catching the water so that they could all of them have a ration of water for washing and washing their clothes and their bandages. The fact that they, from a barren island, they asked for seeds to be brought over and they planted gardens, they had vegetable plots, they finally had their own animals, they had their barbers' shops, they had their tavernas. They really did make a Greek village for themselves.
Dr. Grammatikakis became governor of Spinalonga in 1932. Under his administration, many changes were made. The laundry was improved, an electrical generator was brought to the island. In fact, houses on Spinalonga had electricity long before many villages on the mainland. In 1937, a new hospital and laboratory were built. But the doctor was always a commuter from Ias Nikolaos. During the Second World War, the Germans occupied Crete. Now, they didn't station any troops on Spinalonga, but they did keep guards on the shore within sight. The lepers were starved by the Germans and the Italians. Fish became their only source of food, but that wasn't enough to sustain them.
Each day you would see 2 or 3 people dying from hunger. A few would swim to the opposite side. One was swimming back, and the Germans shot him and brought him to us dead. But the peasants would send a boat for us at night and say, "So many years we've been taking your money. It's our turn to help you." They would give us lentils, rice, bread, olives, beans. They were really generous. They gave them to us free.
I went twice to my village. Once when the Germans had just occupied Crete, and then again when they killed my father in 1942, and stayed a few days.
The cruelest part of the intervention of the war was that it delayed the introduction of the greatest breakthrough in history in the control of Hansen's disease, the name leprosy is known by. How many lepers on Spinalonga would have been saved agony and death if the new drug had not had to wait 6 years to become available to them? A sulfone derivative was found to be effective in arresting the pernicious effect of the leprosy bacillus. It didn't cure the disease in the strict sense of the term, but it did keep it in check. After the war, when the lepers learned of the advances, they realized that their isolation was now pointless. Their anger at being stuck on Spinalonga mounted.
Apart from myself, there was a lawyer and a reporter. I was their assistant. They said, "Gentlemen, we are going to fight. Today, Hansen's disease is being coped with. Therefore, it's not right that we are on this rock. So the rock must die."
I sent a letter to a newspaper, which was published, and fell into the hands of the administration. They asked me why I did it, and would send me to exile.
It was against the establishment.
Oh, I was very angry. I started it by saying, "I am writing from the horrible rock of Spinalonga, which isn't fit even for dogs."
But centuries of prejudice can't be swept away too easily. The public fear remained.
Even if you thought you were cured, even if the doctors thought that your leprosy had halted, it was very unlikely they'd have let you go back into the society that you'd left, and most unlikely that the society would have accepted you. Once you'd been to the island, that was it.
The exploitation was great. To abolish Spinalonga took a very long time, because the surrounding area was barren. The villagers and the local politicians wouldn't let it die, because the island was a source of great wealth to them. Where would they sell their meat and their milk? Each government might have wanted to get it out of there. It was in the state's interest, but there was also still the biblical curse. So they said, leave them there. It was a titanic fight.
Before the war, the Greek government had planned to extend the leper colony. In 1948, they went ahead with the first stages of the scheme. They built 2 blocks of flats, and the lepers who were still being sent to Spinalonga usually found themselves in the flats. The established inhabitants preferred their old houses. The fight to close Spinalonga dragged on until 1954, when it was decided the lepers should be freed. The colony closed down finally in 1957. George, who'd always been considered a troublemaker, was moved early. Spiros was among the last 30 to leave. Ironically, they both found themselves back in the same hospital in Athens they'd left so many years before, but now it was reconditioned and rebuilt, just as George and Spiros had to set about rebuilding their lives. And Spinalonga represented much.
I was leaving my youth behind, and I brought old age and troubles home here. One balanced the other, but I left my youth there.
Me also.
I had stayed there 14 years.
The new leper today has no disfigurement. To look at him, even a doctor would hardly know. If we showed you a patient now, you wouldn't realize he was ill, because the treatment is so good.
Yes, today, by law, we are free. You see, paradise came to us with the discovery of the drug. For instance, I am a public servant. How would it be possible for the government to employ me if there was any doubt? I come into contact with everyone.
George's return to the modern world, his reliving, as he calls it, brought him an experience of great joy as well as pain.
I can tell you that the reliving was painful, because for many I was dead. My people would say he was the family stigma. I was dead for many, as I was dead for my brothers. But for my nephews and nieces, the second generation, 3 years ago I sprouted again. The second and third generation didn't know about me. I heard one evening that my brother was in the Hippocratean hospital. So I said to my wife, come on. We went to the Hippocratean. He was in the agony of death. But there I saw my brothers-in-law and their children, my nephews and nieces. All of them said, who is he? One of my nieces said, oh, he's some kind of father's relative. Another niece, though, the same age as me, said, yes, he is his brother. I was resurrected there and then. I entered the family. The children of the second and third generation adore me. But it was painful. My brother's death returned me to life.
And yet, he's never sure he has truly been returned to life. People still won't shake George's hand or stand too near. No amount of reassurance will ever make him believe that he's not still an outcast, that the stigma of Spinalonga isn't always between him and us.
However much you try to convince me, you can't. I'm sure that you have Even a little reserve?
In Athens, the sun begins to beat down a little too hot, and the two men take their leave. And in Aios Nikolaos, Captain Manolis Koukorakis no doubt prepares his boat for another pleasure trip across the Bay of Mirambella.
I hope you heard about Spinalonga. It's a little tiny island on the northwest side of this Mirabello Gulf, with a Venetian fort all around to the island and the Leper colony inside. Today, because the weather is very, very calm, we're going around to the island to see Spinalonga.
That was Island of the Living Dead, presented by Louis Robinson. The voice of George was provided by George Koulouris and Spiros by Steve Plaitas. The descriptions of life on the leper colony of Spinalonga were translated by Anita Darby. The Island of the Living Dead